extension of Rensselaer County, and this is another one of our Wednesday Lunch in the Garden programs, which are a lot of fun to do. We haven't done these since the spring, and now here it is November of 2024, and we're getting back in the groove. We have 3 programs. Today's program on seed planting and growing. Next week, we're going to have a program on plants for the autumn garden, which is Wednesday, November 13th. And then we're going to skip to Wednesday, December 4th. And Marie and Bob, who are our speakers today, will be coming back and talking about money-saving techniques to jumpstart your garden plants. So this is just a little kind of end of the year Zoom. We've been thinking that, gardening is going to keep going and going and going because it's 75 degrees out and we can still be outside. So why not do a few Zooms? So we're very glad to have all of you here today, and thank you for coming and spending your lunchtime with us. Just a couple other little program notes. If you'd like to ask a question, if you can type it in the chat box down below. We'll take the questions afterwards. And what we'll do is post this video on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and type in Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County, eventually our recording will be on that channel. And you can watch it again and share it with your friends. So I think we're ready to go. And our speakers today are Marie Hankle-Wieboldt and Bob Wieboldt. They're both master gardeners. They come from out Nassau way in the town of the county of Rensselaer, a town of Nassau, and they do lots of different types of gardening. But I would say probably their #1 love is vegetable gardening, and they're very knowledgeable seed starters and propagators of plants. So thank you, Marie and Bob, and it's all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. We're going to talk today about gardening in the wintertime. It's a very big subject, from internal gardening and starting seeds in the house and all that sort of thing. We're going to have to pass on that. There's also greenhouses and, a whole bunch of structures in the garden and growing under those. And we're going to focus on using the winter for certain kinds of plants that need cold stratification. And we're going to talk about what vegetables and ornamentals can be cold sown and grown outdoors. And also how to start seeds and grow cold hardy plants outside. To get started, we have to look at our basic USDA zones. Along the Hudson River, we've got a zone 6, which is down to -10 degrees to -5 degrees. It's a little bit warmer than the hill country of Rensselaer or the hill country of Albany, which is a zone 5B. So we should keep in mind what our zone is in the context of selecting any plants we're going to be using. Now is the time that we're cleaning up our beds, we're storing our tomato claches and trellises, we sharpen and store our tools, we pause and we await winter. We await the arrival of next year's seed catalogs. We'll be talking about that in the subsequent program. But we can do more. We can be preparing today for sowing outdoors, winter sowing. Have you ever sown seeds that never come up? They leave you scratching your head when there's no sign of life after 6 weeks or in the spring. Then you grab the seed packet and you try to read it and see, did I do something wrong? You find out that the seeds need fall planting or cold stratification. Whoops. What's winter sowing all about? Well, some plants absolutely require a cold period, usually from anywhere from 1 to 3 months before germinating. Now, a seed is something that's alive inside. There's an embryo. Some seeds that we can put in, all they need is moisture. Good soil mix, a little moisture, and they'll sprout. They can sprout under grow lights, they can sprout indoors, they can sprout outdoors. But others require a cold period, a rest period. These are usually perennials, very rarely vegetables or annuals. Cold hardy vegetables and annuals can be jump-started by winter sowing. Mostly these are the leafy vegetables, things that would bolt in the summer. All your lettuces, for example, or salad greens. Your brassicas, all your cabbages. Some root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and the like, and anything that's an early spring flower. Um, in late winter, you can even plant tomatoes and peppers outdoors in the snow. So let's talk about cold stratification first. Plants native to cooler climates require a period of cold weather to break their dormancy, to initiate the germination process. Now, every one of these little dry seeds that you look at has a kernel within it that basically is a clock. It reacts to things. Normally, you put in a little moisture, you've got the soil, but it's waiting for that cold period. It mimics nature. If you think about a perennial, the seeds fall in the ground, it comes back the next year. So you're basically talking about uh, using the cold weather to germinate the seed. And we can do this by using certain techniques that actually give you a better product. Now, stratification needs are based on the plant's native habitat. Cold coneflower, for example, thrives after 8 to 12 weeks of cold stratification. Butterfly weed may need 30 days. By replicating the natural processes through cold stratification, we can enhance our gardens with a variety of flourishing plants that might otherwise prove challenging to grow from seed. Now, many plants that need cold stratification will grow, but your germination rates will be slow. Now, again, we're talking about mimicking nature. You know, we've all seen volunteer seeds grow in beds and compost piles. 2 years ago, I went out in my compost pile in the spring, and wow, there were 7 tomato plants growing there. I had no idea what they were. We called them mystery tomatoes and put them in the garden, transplanted them, and grew them. But we see it in beds too. Kale can survive an entire winter sometimes and start over. This year, I had all sorts of celery that made it through the winter and came back. So all seeds, however, go dormant under the snow in the cold months. They spring to life when the snow melts, when the conditions are right. Now, each seed knows what it needs, and it varies. And if it is in a temperature, let's say refrigerator temperature, maybe 35 to 38 degrees for a long period of time, depending on the seed, they basically will sprout, and they have to do this if they can survive in the cold. So they're on their own in the winter if they're outdoors. They need the growing medium, they need some moisture, and they need protection from wind and extreme cold. They will only come back if they're not dead, and they can be killed by things that affect the wintertime. Now, cold sowing techniques can control these factors to improve your germination. You can find out whether your plant needs cold stratification, usually by looking at the seed packet. Look for certain words: perennials, native, plant before last frost, cold stratification required, start dates after frost, requires a cold period, plant in the fall. These are all hints that you may have to do a cold stratification before the seed will germinate properly. Let's look at a seed packet. This packet is for Verbascum mullein. It says sow outside when 2 to 4 weeks before your last average frost date, or up to 2 months before your average first fall date. If sown as early as January in mild climates, they may bloom in the first year, etc. You're basically looking at the hints that this is something they can do and use cold weather effectively. The other possibility is to look at the plant's background online. Check it out. Search for the plant's name, botanical or otherwise. Find out its requirements, its height, its hardiness. And then you'll find things like, in this case, we're talking about Arnica montana. It should be soaked for 4 hours before stratification. They need cool, moist stratification for about 8 weeks before they're ready to germinate. You're not going to find this sometimes on the seed packet. They also need light, so do not cover them with soil. Gently press them into the seed starting mix with potting soil. That tells you how to handle it and the basics of doing it outdoors. Now, there's a whole series of methods. We can talk about greenhouses, hoop houses, cold frames. They can all be used, of course. You can also cold stratify in your refrigerator if you can get your spouse to let you use it 2 or 3 shelves. but you're talking sometimes many months. Can you imagine a nice tray taking up a tray that would normally be vegetables or sauces or whatever with flower pots in your refrigerator? Do you have to buy a whole new refrigerator to give yourself the time you need? So we're basically talking about trying to take it out and keep your refrigerator for food. Winter sowing methods. We're going to talk today about simpler, less costly techniques that can be used without these structures. Milk or water jugs, uncapped and prepared for opening, and storage totes and boxes with clear removable lids. Those will be our little focus for the next few minutes. Take a jug. Basically, it's a 1 gallon water and milk jug. We were sending away for them, and it was costing us $4 or $5 each. And we found out we could buy one filled with distilled water in Walmart for $1.45. So we used a lot of distilled water for various things, and we kept doing it, and we kept bothering all our neighbors and relatives. Give us any of your milk jug. You got to clean them. You got to remove the caps. You got to drill some drainage holes, 4, 5, 6 in the bottom. You can use a flay bit or even a Dremel or just punch through it and all. You make horizontal cut through 3 sides opposite the handle of the jug. And you get what is shown in the bottom picture on this slide, a lid that can be closed. You have to add probably, you cut it to make that horizontal cut should be 5 inches from the bottom, because you're going to need a minimum of 4 inches of moist potting soil. And I'll say potting soil, not seed starting mix. Seed starting mix will dry out too quickly and doesn't provide any nutrients whatsoever. Potting soil does. And I think if you leave 4 inches of soil in a 5-inch bottom, you've got enough room for the root growth and to give yourself good seedlings. Also, plant seeds on the surface simply by patting them down. Don't bury them very deeply. And then a little surface cover, could be vermiculite, could be a little bit more potting soil, and then pat them down and mist them. The soil itself, I should add, should be moist. In other words, not wet. If you squeeze it, there should be no water running out of it. If you squeeze it, it should not be dry and run through your fingers. It's got to be that clump that you can hold within your fist, and that's about right for planting. So when you do this, you insert a label marker inside telling you what it is, and outside you mark with a permanent marker. Now, most of the permanent markers will suffer a little bit in outdoor use over the winter, so that's why you've got the double. You're going to close the lid. You're going to tape over the horizontal cut. You can use duct tape, transparent packaging tape, etc., because in certain situations you may have to open it up during the wintertime. You can store outside in a sheltered area, basically east to southeast facing. You really want to protect it from the direct north winds. One of the areas I've used is in between raised beds. They get sheltered by the raised beds. It still get the temperature you need outdoors. Use storage totes. Now, another approach. Oh, there's one more approach you can use on this bottle business. I just picked it up the other day on the internet. You can take a 2-liter soda bottle. I guess they're 2 liters. The tall, big ones, that have Coke or Pepsi or whatever in it. You simply cut them 5 inches from the bottom and put a few slits in the top, and the top will sit over the bottom. And basically, if you put your drainage holes in the same way you're doing with the jug, you can do it maybe without the taping. It's just brand new to me. I've never tried it. It's obviously a little smaller than the gallon jug, but it might work and be very inexpensive, and it saves you just to go recycling your.
And then the lid goes over.
The label goes over the top of it. Now, select a clear storage tote with a clear top. This is another approach. Here you're doing your standard seed starting in pots. You're putting the pots in what's a mini greenhouse. You drill a series of holes in the top and the base for drainage and ventilation. You sow seeds following the packet directions in small pots, place them in this container, label each pot with a marker, store outside again on an east or southeast facing wall.
But you still use potting mix
You
and
still
not
use
seed
potting
starting.
mix, not seed starting. You put drainage holes in the bottom and the top. Now, that is a very simple way to, and it can be used in any size, depending on what you want to put in it. Some examples, you can use like 2-inch square pots with some little round ones, put them in. You can use one of those standard peat packages or small little 2-inch pots inside a plastic top. You can do it on a small or a big. We have them basically, they're 2 feet by what, 15, Marie?
Yeah, probably.
By about, maybe 12, 15 inches high. With the removable lid, they can get moisture in there, what you put in the beginning, got your soil mix, you've got light, you've got air, and you've got some drainage in case you get some water in there, and you have enough holes in the top to allow some moisture to come in over the winter. Now, the benefits of outdoor winter sowing are simple. You don't have to have a dedicated interior space. We are building a greenhouse this year, but right now we're using a den of ours where we've got racks of lights and grow lights, and it's more of a greenhouse than a living room at the moment. You don't need the grow lights for this process. You don't need constant maintenance of the seedlings. You don't have a forced schedule, put it in and plant so many days before it's going to grow. And, all during February or March, you're trying to meet a schedule for your seeding indoors. You don't have to harden them off because they'll be out all winter and they'll be hardened off already. So you don't lose that time. And you don't take up refrigerator space if you're doing cold stratification. Now, how to cold stratify? First of all, you set containers outdoors after the temperatures are consistently at or below freezing. You really want to get a temperature inside this mini greenhouse, which will be a higher temperature than the ground or the surrounding air by as much as 10, sometimes 15 degrees. So you're trying to go out and put them out when it's likely. January is best for most cold stratification. And if you're going to be doing vegetables and things that are not specifically cold stratification, but simply cold sowing, you can be out there in February and even early March. Anyway, seeds will be dormant until the internal temperature of the container is right for sprouting. You have to watch moisture though. A dry winter can basically make your soil arid and take the moisture out of it, desiccated. So you've got to check moisture levels. And you do that periodically, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, whenever it's convenient. You get out and you look at it. Now, if these bottles are being used, you can use a sprayer and just spray and mist down a little bit. That'll give you the water you need. If you've put too much water in, you might want to unwrap the tape and wipe out the container because you can get mold in some of these things if there's too much moisture inside the jug. When unusually warm weather is expected, now the cold stratification works at what did I say, 35 to 38 degrees ideally. But if it goes below freezing, for example, you don't count, the seed doesn't count that day or count that hour as cold stratification that it needs. If you took a seed and you put it in a refrigerator for an hour, brought it out again, it loses what it just gained. So what you need is this constant exposure to cold. So if it's going to be above 50 degrees, if it's above 60, it's not going to cold stratify. So look at about 50 degrees, look at your weather report. You might want to open the containers during the day, close them at night. When frigid weather, which is below minus 28, which is that one level that tends to freeze almost any plant, is expected, protect jugs with a frost covering of some kind. You can use plastic, you can use row covers. We've even gone out on cold nights where we expect really, really hard frost and use sheets. Open and transplant seedings when they're several inches tall. And otherwise, just let nature do its thing. So it's a minimal maintenance during the wintertime, just enough to make sure things are growing. And when you see it grow, you're going to have seedlings that don't have to be hardened, And if the time is right, you can put them right in the ground. Some successful tips, I think, and no-nos, I guess, at the same time. It's easier to lay out the seeds you want at cold start, lay the seed packets out, figure out how many jugs you're going to use, do it all at once. In other words, just line up your jugs, line up your seed packets, write your labels out. Don't try to do it one at a time. It'll take forever. Again, do not use seed starting mix. It's got too much opportunity for the loss of moisture, and it's simply not nutrient rich at all because it doesn't have any. Potting soil is what you should be using. Don't plant too early. You're going to find out, we'll give you a reference to a source for finding out exactly how much cold stratification you need. But basically, most vegetables can go in mid-February, most cold stratification things in January. Today, however, you can be starting by collecting those containers, and you can be using the next few weeks to do your necessary cutting, etc. Don't fill the containers too early. If you went out tomorrow, for example, and made a few containers and you cut them up and you put your soil in, but you're not going to plant it until January, they'll dry out. And you'll have to go and I don't know what you do. You go into each one and water it. It's so when you fill the container, fill it just before you're going to plant the seed. When you plant the seed, keep some seed separation. I think the basic rule is 1 to a hole. So if you're putting little holes in for the pencil, I use the eraser end of a pencil and drop the seed in a little bit. You're not going very deep. You're just under the surface, but try to keep them separated so you don't have a situation where 3 or 4 seedlings are growing in the same quarter inch.
And you can't separate them when you transplant.
Right. Separation is very hard. Make sure a minimum of 4 inches of soil. Check containers periodically for mold, excess water, or insufficient water. Make sure the containers are draining properly, and try not to compare your indoor results to outdoor results. The outdoor winter sowing will give you a very hardy plant, suitable for going into the ground, and maybe a little smaller than your indoor grown typical seedling. On the other hand, there's been a lot of anecdotal experience that they'll grow faster, better, and have thicker stems because they've had that exposure to the outside. So try not to compare and contrast, deal with what you've got and live with it. Also, you'll know that the time that this plant stays in the ground from germination to maturity might be a little longer than typically, but I think you'll find that the end result is good. I was reading this last month's issue of Horticulture magazine. I came upon a very interesting article, which talked about, was written by a fellow that grew up in Maine, and who's a landscape architect or horticulturist. He noticed that on many of the many conifers and deciduous shrubs can grow on rocky ledges on the side of mountains next to the seacoast, and in effect become dwarfs. They're natural bonsais. And I was impressed enough to say I'd like to add that to this presentation today. They're suitable for planting in the Capital District. Maria, you can have conifers, pines, junipers, cedars, yews. They will all grow some 100 feet tall. But if you keep them in a container outdoors, you get a balance that essentially will the size of the plant and the amount of growing area will sort of marry, and you'll get something that needs little maintenance, can be very attractive, and it also includes certain deciduous plants. The fellow who wrote the book comes from New England, so you got cranberry, linden trees, locust trees, even willows. Almost anything can be grown in the outdoor container in the wintertime with certain steps that you have to take, some of which I'll go over quickly. First of all, you can use a container that can consist of tufa. Tufa is it's a natural porous limestone that essentially is the rock gardener's delight if you can find it. You can make something called a hypertufer, which is a mixture of 1/3 peat, 1/3 cement, 1/3 perlite, added water to it, mixed, put into a mold, left for 10 days to dry, and it becomes a very interesting but lightweight, relatively lightweight planter. You have wood planters, they can be square, round, there's a whole range of those. Stoneware over flower pots, because stoneware tends to be glazed and harder and will not wick water away. And you can use plastic mimicking stoneware. We came upon a series of like 24-inch top around about 2 feet deep. They look like they're basically blackened purple stoneware pots, but they are probably no more than 2 pounds. And if you can plant them, move them around, they're very good. So any one of those things will good. And you've got to look at how much of a plant you want versus how much soil you've got. The soil itself is interesting. It's not your typical potting mix, which is going to be a little too porous, have too much organic in it. The recommended soil is 1/3 of aggregate, including some calcite and basically ground shale, 1/3 compost, peat moist mix, and 1/3 loam soil. And you've got to allow for drainage, and you got to fill a pot completely with soil to avoid pockets of water that might freeze and split the container during the wintertime or do damage to the roots. Now, there are certain resources to get into this in depth. There's an awful lot of information out there. First of all, there's a Facebook group on facebook.com/group/winter sowing. You'll find a list of groups that you could join, many of which are in our climate zones. You can use a YouTube inquiry, just ask for cold stratification or winter sowing, give you a lot of sources. The author of the book, Warren Leach, his article is in the November-December issue of Horticulture magazine. He also has a book out right around now at the end of 24, which basically is planting winter container gardening. And for germination, we were listening to a YouTube presentation and we picked up a site that's fascinating. It's the Ontario Rock Garden and Hardy Plant Society website. This has maybe 10,000 individual plants with all the basic details about whether they need, what germination techniques, how much water, what kind of sunlight, all the basic information, plus the experiences of master gardeners and general gardeners and horticulturists who've added commentary to the growing of the plant. It's the best resource I've ever come upon for almost any kind of flower, perennials, native wildlife delight. So I would, just as an aside, check into this. And there you see a really good picture of what you can do outdoors in the wintertime. So thank you very much for joining with us today. We hope you're excited to continue gardening through the winter months. We hope we've given you a couple of ideas. Start collecting your planting containers and supplies now if you're interested, and keep your potting soil from freezing. It's very nice to be able to start in January, but if your potting soil is an ice cube, you're going to have a hard time. So thanks for attending, and we're here to take any questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob and Marie. So if anybody has any questions, please type them in the chat. We have time for that, certainly. And I was wondering, I had a couple questions myself. I guess, would you say that your seedlings are more compact in this kind of system? Because I always think of leggy seedlings when I'm starting them inside.
I think you're basically talking about having access to the same amount of sunlight and not as much as you'd have under grow lights. So you're going to get probably smaller seedlings. But the interesting thing is that since they're outdoors, they're almost like direct seeded initially because they're exposed to the weather. You're going to get thicker stems
And hardier.
and a hardier plant.
You won't
So
get
let's see.
leggy. Yeah, the leggy, you won't get the leggy that you find underneath your grow light. It may not shoot up as tall right away until the weather becomes warmer, but you get a thicker, more comprehensive starting stem than you would have under a grow light system.
See, the other thing is you're not having the plant reach for the light, which is the main course, I think, of legging this.
Right.
You're too high, or you're in a windowsill and it reaches toward the window. Here you've got it in a plastic bottle where, in effect, if it's exposed to the sunlight on all sides, it's going to get equivalent light. So it hasn't got a tendency to want to reach.
Okay, so Marco asks, when is the best time to start in January?
Again, the one danger here is you do not want to have your plant ready to go out while you still have cold weather. So you've got to be able to figure that out a little bit. If you go too early, let's say you went on New Year's Day, you may have a plant ready to plant in early March, in which case you'd have to pot it and take it inside and not be able to put it in your garden. So that's why you've got to do a little research and find out how much cold stratification it requires and what the time period is. If it says 3 months and you want to plant on April 1st, yeah, going on New Year's Day. If it's going to be, you want to plant after the first frost, you might be February. So vegetables, essentially, I plant, last year I started doing this with late February for things like peas and lettuces that I wanted to get in early and get a crop before the bolting in the summertime came. So you put them in around mid-February, third week February, you got them ready by April, mid-April, early enough to put in while the ground's still workable.
For perennials, I've done usually around the second or third week of January, figuring that I'm going to want to put them in the ground around first or second week of April, which is usually where we don't really get too much of a frost, but these guys have already been acclimated. So they can tolerate. It depends. If you're doing a very tender perennial, you'll want to start that later because you want that to be into the May category when you transplant it and put it in your garden. But I found the second to third week of January has worked well for the perennials that I've added to my garden.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's see. What about moist paper towels in the refrigerator in a Ziploc bag for cold stratification?
This works, except you're in the refrigerator with your cold paper towels and your Ziploc bags. If you're doing any kind of volume, you're taking up space. It will work well. Particularly if it's a damp but not soaking wet paper, it's very interesting to try to do that. If it's too little water, they're going to die. If it's too much water, they're going to get rot. So you've got issues, but if you dampen a paper towel, squeeze it so there's very little moisture left in it, lay it in, put your seeds out. And what you're going to get are seedlings that basically have those first two leaves attached to a little bit of a root, and you're going to be very delicate and deal with it because they're going to have to go into pots then. It's hard to take those and bring them all the way outdoors. What grows on that paper towel inside a bag is going to be very small, very delicate. I would put it in a regular potting medium and then take it outside. To me, I think the refrigerator space is important. I've seen people actually put it in little pots and put the pots in a frame and put the frame in the refrigerator. You really lose the shelf that way. So it's just a question of what your spacing is and whether you have plenty of refrigeration area.
Or there are some literature out there where you may want to mix it with a little bit of moistened sand.
Yes.
Then you can put that on your paper towel, moistened, and then in your bag. There's pros and cons, but the indication from the research is that that provides a little more success because you've got some kind of soil for it to adhere to. It doesn't just lay on top of a paper towel because if it goes beyond the incubation period, then it may start rotting, where a little bit of the sand keeps it from rotting and the longevity. And I guess it's easier for transplanting to a pot.
Now, if you're doing only a few, one of the things you can do is take a Ziploc bag, let's say a quart one, and put soil in the bottom and plant in the soil, leave a little opening at the top, and do it with the soil rather than a paper towel mix approach. That again takes up even more space. There's an outdoor technique where you can take gallon bags, put 4 inches of soil in the bottom of each. You put one hole through and you run a rod through a hole. Like clothes hanging is the best way to describe it. Each one of your bags will hang on a rod. You support the rod on either end. Like if you have a fence in a raised bed situation, you can go across a corner and you'd have your bags hanging out there. I haven't tried that because I think it's a little risky because of wind and weather, but it's a technique that people do use for winter sowing outdoors.
How about putting the milk jugs in a greenhouse? Would that be a good idea? I don't think that would
Yeah,
really
I'm
help
not
you.
getting the effect of, we talk about when it's going to be really cold and frigid, where you want to throw a blanket over it or something
Yeah.
like that. Or put them back into a cold front. Yes, the answer is you can actually don't even have to use the milk jugs. You can use flower pots in the greenhouse. The greenhouse is what's doing it for you. The question though is that people tend to do this outside so the greenhouse can be used for other things. There's one of the ideas here is when you're using the pots, as you saw some of our photos, you can just put a row of these or a stack almost anywhere. Use an aisle that you're not going to be using in the winter between raised beds, for example. Put it on top of a raised bed that's otherwise dormant. You don't have to waste what I consider precious space within the greenhouse for this purpose.
How about, did you put the cover back on the bottles or were they left open? I think she means the lid.
Yeah, leave the lid open, period.
Leave the lid off. Okay. We are looking to construct a
Yeah.
passive energy greenhouse, but attaching to the house, the home, is not possible. We could place the greenhouse out in the field near the garden, but I'm not sure of orientation or placement to allow for early seed starts. What are your thoughts? That's a big question.
Yeah, you basically on a greenhouse like that, we had issues with locating ours. When you do a greenhouse, you can buy a lot of them that are already set up. So whatever, I'm not sure what your structure
The
is.
orientation.
The orientation is the sun. The sun's going to be low in the southeast at 2 periods of time. One is the fall, one is the early spring. You also can look at trees. If you're looking at seed starting, you can actually be close to a treed area or wooded area because leaves aren't there yet. But think of it as like a 20 some odd degree angle, all the way up to, directly overhead, maybe a little past overhead, and then it settles back down again in our climate. So the answer to that question is north to south, east to west doesn't really matter as long as the sun hits the spot for a longest period of time you can develop. You need to get some, particularly for seed starting, you need early spring sun.
Yeah.
That's very important. And if you're
Pick
going to
up
do
the east, the south, and part of the west.
right. So we have ours basically oriented, it's going to be 16 feet long. It's oriented toward the south.
East, southwest.
The east is woods. I'm only going to get a little bit of light there, but I'm going to get some afternoon sun. I'm going to get evening sun. I'm going to get a lot of sun in the wintertime. In fact, I'm worried about shading that in the summertime, I mean. So that's what you really got to do is make sure your light can reach it. Do not put it behind a house or something like that where you're going to block out it for so many hours. You're still trying to get For seeds starting anywhere up to 12 to 16 hours of sunlight, if you can do that. That's why you use grow lights. You need at least 6 to grow vegetables, but to make seeds happen, you need more than that. So you've got to be able to maximize morning, afternoon, and midday sun. So that locate it in a place, if it's near your garden or near your house, get it outside so you have like a 360 room around it so the sun can get at it from all sides.
Now is really the time to be watching how the sun
Right.
rises, where it is at different times of the day. And you should do that, at least a month. Well, actually, you're going to have to see how it takes after December 21st to see where that is. But you've got to study where the sun actually hits at different times of the day to give you the data to say this is the best place I've got to put the greenhouse.
The alternative would be
maximize
if you can
on the
run power
sunlight.
to your greenhouse, you can add lighting. If you're not getting as many hours as you would need. Indoor lighting, I tend to want to get at least 16 hours in the early
In the
days, and
beginning,
then 12 hours once the seedlings start. So I'll do that by switching them on and switching them off when I go to bed and wake up. You can do that on a timer, but if you can get power to your greenhouse, then you can establish both. You get the benefit of the solar heating and the solar sunlight to start your plants growing, but you can also supplement it by additional light that you may not get in the deep of winter.
I would say that we had a really great cooperative extension program on greenhouses back in the 70s and 80s when people were very interested in energy conservation and at the University of Connecticut. So if you went on a browser or search engine and you typed in UConn or University of Connecticut and you typed in passive greenhouse, I wonder if they've got a lot of those resources still up, because even though they were done, that research was done in the 70s and 80s and 90s, that would still apply today. And we used to have a lot of good bulletins. Remember when we had paper and pamphlets and booklets, and a lot of that came out of UConn. I don't know if that's been digitized, but they had a lot of great resources back in the day from UConn.
The walls and the dark floors with the top. Yeah. In construction, the same way. You can build a greenhouse by creating a space to basically take the heat in. Usually, like say black painted 5-gallon buckets stacked in a place where the sun will hit. They will get warm and they'll stay warm at night. You can sometimes use these solar techniques to offset. You can have an insulated floor and you can put down dark brick. If the sun hits the brick, it'll stay there and radiate at night. There's a lot of solar techniques like that that can help you not have to provide heat to it.
Yeah, and the other guy that did a lot of work with that was Elliot Coleman, who may still be around up in Maine. I would Google Elliot Coleman too in Maine, because he used to do a lot of work with his unheated hoop house and growing things in the winter in Maine. So I think we got one last question for you guys. Can winter sowing be adapted to be done under a cold covered porch or in an unheated 3-season room? Would it be an advantage to use those spaces?
Unheated room, no question. Under a porch, you may be cutting out light. So,
It depends, yes.
So that's the only issue. You do need sunlight. And if you put it in a too shady area, you're not going to get enough.
Right, right. So I don't know that that's a real advantage to use those places.
Yeah, it just depends on the amount of sunlight.
Yeah. Well, for ease of convenience, let's say you have a deck off your house. You want to go out and put a dozen of these jugs, against one edge of the deck. It's easy to reach. You may be brushing the deck off with snow anyway in the wintertime. You can get at them.
Yeah, but the snow acts as an installation.
The snow around it is very good. If you put them in and they get covered in snow, Wonderful.
What are some of the favorite things you guys have done with this? Your favorite vegetables or species that you've done?
I actually did some peas and they started pretty well, which I thought was interesting. We've done a couple of different kinds of lettuces. We had a little trouble with the romaine because it's a little bit more sensitive to cold. But we had, basically mash and that kind of green, some of the baby bok choy, it all worked. And I had some losses. I had some that got a little moldy and then some that we didn't check the water on and they dried out. So it's an experiment. You got to do it one season and see what happens and then, improve each time as you go.
Right. It worked well for my perennials.
Yes, or flowers.
So the perennials all worked well. And I'd have to say that I got more that survived using the cold stratification with the perennials than I would have if I sowed outside. And I'm not sure if it was, just the preparation of the soil, but this was starting with a decent potting mix. And it was just easier to have that and just transplant to various areas than set up one area where I had to use for seed starting. So I found that the cold stratification for me worked 10 times better than it would be just setting up a seed area for growing perennial.
I'm going
Yeah.
to try pepper and tomato this year or next year, and we'll see how that goes out. But you can advance your growing season significantly that way. We'll see what happens.
Well, it's all a grand experiment.
Yes.
So I want to say thank you to Marie and Bob. That was really interesting. It really got me thinking about maybe I can do some of this. I've never done this exact technique myself, so I'm kind of be interested in trying it. And I think it was great we did this today because we have plenty of time to get all of our equipment ready and make our labels and get our containers. If we were doing this in January, we'd be scurrying around. So we wanted to do this early enough in the season so everybody could have a chance to get all their equipment ready and their seeds ready to go. So thank you, Marie and Bob. I appreciate you being here today. They do a lot of great programs and they're always a lot of fun and great resource full of knowledge and always learning things and sharing them with us. So we appreciate you guys very